Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia. Ballotpedia connects people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on the top political stories of the day. I'm Frank Festa, and thanks for being with us. Debate over private funding of election administration efforts has been going on for a while now, but it really started to pick up steam ahead of the 2020 general election, when individuals like Mark Zuckerberg made donations to organizations that subsequently made donations themselves to election administrators. Momentum has been building ever since around the country to revise how our elections get funded. And with this being an election year, after all, we're bound to see more action and debate before long. Today, I'm joined by BP staff writer Joe Greeny. Joe, thanks for coming on the show.
Frank, good to be here. It's always fun catching up with you and talking about all things election administration or whatever is going on at the moment.
Yeah, likewise, man. Now, opponents sometimes call these sorts of donations Zuck Bucks, which admittedly is catchy for sure, but there's arguments both for and against whether or not private funding should be allowed in the first place. So can you tell us a little bit more about what happened in 2020 that really accelerated the policy battle we're seeing play out today?
Yeah, I think it certainly had a lot to do with the moment and what was going on leading up to the 2020 general election. You know, what was already going to be a closely scrutinized election was thrown into just the chaos and tumult of COVID-19. And we saw a huge effort from governors, state legislators, local election officials, and others to try and adapt to the circumstances and hold elections in the midst of all that uncertainty. And there were new challenges, everything from acquiring PPE that fell on the local election administrators mostly, passing laws to allow for increased mail-in voting, which was a state legislative issue. In most cases, sometimes that involved state governors as well. But yeah, the efforts to adjust took a number of different forms, and there were a lot of associated costs. The donations from Zuckerberg came sort of within that context. And actually, the program to which he made the sort of Zuckerberg and his wife, Priscilla Chan, made the most substantial donations to was called the COVID-19 Response Grant Program. It was made to an organization called the Center for Tech and Civic Life, which has sort of been at the center of this Zuck Bucks controversy. But yeah, I think it gives you an idea of what the goal of donations was. It was to respond to changes to elections and just to the uncertainty of the COVID-19 moment. And then just a couple of things that CTCL, the Center for Tech and Civic Life, listed as part of that COVID-19 response grant program, what the intended uses of these funds were, included things like poll worker recruitment, polling place rental, temporary staffing support, PPE, as I mentioned. So yeah, that was the main thrust of why these donations were made. And then as far as the response to the donations, I'm not going to speculate on whether or not the reaction had something to do with Zuckerberg himself and sort of the character that he is and sort of the role that he plays in the American mind as well. But the donations immediately kicked off debate and arguments around sort of the merits of just the idea of private individuals and organizations providing funding to public election officials for the purposes of administering elections. And yeah, that's led to where we're at today.
27 states have enacted laws banning or otherwise restricting the use of private donations for election administration purposes. 21 of those have Republican trifectas, meaning the Republican Party controls all three major branches of government in that state. And the other 6 have divided governments, but effectively speaking, they are 27 GOP states that we're talking about here. So were these laws developed alongside one another, or do they tend to be pretty different?
Yeah, I can't speak to the exact context of how the individual laws were developed. You know, oftentimes we see sort of bill text circulated by third-party organizations around a specific issue and taken up in multiple states. I'm actually not positive if that was the case here, but we did see a substantial amount of overlap between enacted legislation in a number of these states, especially the first movers, which came in that 2021 legislative session right after the 2020 election. Among the 27 states that have enacted laws, there's significant overlap, usually with some small variations between maybe specific officials named and prohibited from receiving or distributing funds, or specific activities named and prohibited in the legislation, or even accepted activities as well. So, but yeah, on the whole, largely similar. And then since the initial bans were enacted, we've actually seen 6 states amend their laws. And all 6 amendments were actually expansions on bans that added sort of new individuals or activities to the list of prohibited donors or prohibited uses of privately donated funds. And we saw some states such as Arkansas drastically broaden prohibited activities. I think this is more of a response to, or a bit of a learning process as lawmakers tried to remove or limit private funding for election administration. So back to Arkansas, they actually removed any reference to election officials in state statute in the prohibition on the use of private funding for election administration, and moved more towards a blanket prohibition on any outside funding for election administration. So by removing the reference to election officials, they replaced it with a reference to any state or county employee or official. So yeah, we've seen a couple states adjust their laws. Indiana was another one where they sort of expanded out similar to Arkansas, and sort of removed specificity about who is prohibited and just tried to blanket prohibit the use of private funding.
So just to make sure I understand you correctly, the argument against private funding of election administration boils down to trying to protect administrators from the influence of donors seeking to push specific policies or improve their public reputations. Am I right? Is there more to the opposition than that? Or does that pretty much sum it up?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. And there's sort of just a fundamental idea that, election administration shouldn't have to rely on private donations, on private funds, that elections are sort of a cornerstone of democracy, that they should be fully publicly funded, or at the very least not have to rely on ad hoc private donations. But yeah, I think the thrust of the argument is that donations and the use of private resources might cause an election official to favor the adoption of specific policies preferred by a donor or grant maker, or donations might be used to do specific targeted outreach to a group of qualified voters, either to get them to register to vote or get them to vote in an upcoming election. There's sort of a lot of wrinkles to that idea of undue influence caused by private donations and private funding of administration. But again, I do think it all falls under that bigger sort of cornerstone idea that, elections should be publicly funded.
Got it. That makes sense. And we've talked about the opposition quite a bit now. So how about the argument against establishing these sorts of policies? What's the argument against restricting the private funding of elections look like?
Yeah, on the flip side, the idea is, and I think a lot of people, I think it's the interesting thing about this debate about private funding is that the critics of these laws banning private funding of election administration would actually agree with the premise that elections should receive public funding and be exclusively funded through public means. I think the critics of these bans, though, would say in the absence of secured and guaranteed public funding, private donations are necessary, and election administrators simply can't do their jobs without increased resources, without these donations, without funds coming from third-party organizations and private individuals. And it's certainly a fact that election administrators are already working in a constrained funding environment. And now in a climate of increased scrutiny on elections, costly updates to equipment, difficulty recruiting and retaining staff, they're facing a lot of challenges. And the answer to a lot of these challenges is increased funding. In many cases, in many states, they're not getting it. And there's also an argument there should be increased federal funding, sort of a different conversation than the state funding. And actually getting into the topic of how elections are funded itself is I think, a whole separate conversation, because it's pretty Byzantine, varies from state to state and within states as well. And I think that's part of the problem, honestly, is that there isn't sort of a clear, established, defined funding mechanism, public funding mechanism, that is, for election administration. So yeah, the flip side of the argument is, again, I think both sides would agree elections should be publicly funded. But the flip side of these bans, the argument against these bans, is that we just don't have that funding right now.
You mentioned before our interview that there's some related legislation addressing foreign spending and ballot measures campaigns. Now, it's not exactly the same thing, of course, but it's related in the sense that it's external funding that's not, directly the result of some sort of public contribution or designation. We saw this most recently in Maine last November when Question 2 passed. So, Joe, what was that ballot measure hoping to achieve? And have we seen anything like it develop since elsewhere around the country?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a different issue, but I think it provides an interesting contrast to this debate around private funding. Question 2 in Maine last year, which passed overwhelmingly, I think with about 85% of the vote, which is quite substantial, was about prohibiting foreign spending or foreign contributions towards ballot committees, which are basically efforts to pass a ballot measure. And this actually came out of a separate ballot measure in Maine, question 1 in 2021, which was about prohibiting the construction of certain high impact utility lines in a region of Maine. And what happened around that ballot question 1 back in 2021, was we saw quite a bit of foreign spending, specifically from Canadian utilities. And I think it was a hydroelectric utility, specifically from Quebec. It was one of the 4 PACs that were spending against that ballot measure. And there was a lot of pushback in the state of Maine to the idea that a foreign entity would be spending to try and influence the outcome of a state ballot question. Now, just to zoom out for a second, the idea of spending on ballot questions is a bit different than private donations or foreign donations for election administration. And a lot of the bans, actually almost all of the bans that we've seen on election administration, that's the 27 bans that we were talking about earlier that have been enacted since 2021, all of those would also prohibit foreign spending on election administration. But this idea of foreign spending on ballot questions is a bit more of a niche topic. It hasn't gotten as much of attention as the idea of spending on election administration. Maine, when they passed that ballot measure in last year, 2023, became the 8th state to do so, the 4th to do so through a ballot question. The 4 other states to do so all did so through state legislation. And I think the topics are related just through this idea of outside spending on elections. I do think it's important to keep in mind, again, just circling back to what I was saying at the start here, that spending on ballot questions on ballot committees is different than spending on election administration. But it does get to this idea of undue influence on elections and sort of this idea that we've seen emerge or consolidate over the last couple of years, gain some strength, that elections, campaign spending, ballot question spending should all be buttoned up and coming from sort of dedicated, understood sources.
So what else is going on in legislatures across the country right now? Is there anything in the pipeline that has a good chance of becoming law, or is there anything that's maybe being talked about that hasn't been brought forth yet?
Yeah, we talked a bit about this last time I was on the podcast talking about private funding last year. The pathway to new bans on the private funding of election administration is fairly narrow. Almost every GOP-controlled legislature in the country has passed one of these bans, and we just don't see the will from or any interest, really, not even the will, from Democratic lawmakers in taking up these bans. And that's just sort of from the polarized take on the issue of private funding that we've already touched on here. So I don't foresee many new bans on the private funding of election administration passing legislatures this year or being enacted. There might be Arizona as a state that might actually pass a bill, but it will likely be vetoed by their Democratic governor, Katie Hobbs. So a couple of situations like that where we've got some GOP legislatures that might try and pass bans. But again, most states where a private funding ban is likely to be enacted have already enacted these laws. We do have about 20, a little bit more than 20 individual pieces of legislation related to private funding active in legislatures right now, as of about mid-March. Just a couple highlights, interesting bills. There's a bill in Illinois, SB 2249, which is a Republican-sponsored bill that directs the State Board of Elections to regulate and maintain oversight of all private non-governmental funds given to an election authority. So this is not a ban. And it's sort of an interesting approach from Republican lawmakers in a Democratic trifecta state to try and sort of legislate around the issue in a way that actually might have a chance to pass in a Democratic controlled state. And again, not banning the use of private donations, but trying to sort of add an oversight layer and making sure that there's sort of a level of transparency around the use of private donations, non-governmental funding. This is actually something that I could see Democratic lawmakers getting on board with. Again, I don't think Democratic lawmakers are opposed to more transparency and oversight of the use of private funding. They're just not going to get on board with banning private funding. Another interesting bill, I just touched on Arizona as well, is SB 1347 in Arizona, which, similar to the Illinois bill, takes a bit of a different approach and maybe for strategic reasons to try and get Democratic support. What it does is it focuses on limiting foreign contributions to election administration. And I should state that there is already a federal ban on the use of foreign funds for election administration. Nevertheless, this is something that we might see taken up in other state legislatures. And then in addition to the bills in Arizona and Illinois that I just touched on, we've got bills in 3 other states that would newly prohibit private election administration funding. They're all Republican sponsored, first off. 2 of those are in Democratic trifecta states, Minnesota and New Jersey, where they likely don't have a path to passage. The third was in Wyoming. That bill actually died already this year, so it won't progress. There's a chance for similar legislation in special legislative sessions later this year in Wyoming if they take place. And yeah, Wyoming is one of those sort of holdout states, GOP-controlled state, Republican trifecta state that currently does not have one of these bans. And then we talked about amendments earlier, states that had enacted these laws and then revisited them to try and tweak statute language, almost always to expand prohibitions to make them a bit more generalized. And we've got 3 more active bills that would do so this year right now in Indiana, North Carolina, and Oklahoma. So those are all states with bans already that are looking to amend the bans and actually expand the bans as well. And expand, I just want to make sure I'm being clear here. When I say expand the ban, I don't just mean they're banning everything left and right, but they're specifically trying to eliminate loopholes, loose language in statute that allows usually local election administrators to receive funding from private sources. I mean, this is something that has, again, come up a couple of times in a couple of different states that ostensibly passed bans and then realized that the statute language actually wasn't tight enough and election administrators could still access private funding and use those funds for election administration. And then just one last thing I want to touch on is actually in the U.S. Congress, probably one of the bigger news items this year. There was actually a hearing in the House Administration Committee. I think it was just a couple of weeks ago now. I'm not sure about the actual date, but it was a hearing on Zuck Bucks at the federal level. And we've also seen reintroduction of what's called the End Zuck Bucks Act by Republican Representative Claudia Tenney from New York. This is a bill that was introduced in the last Congress as well. Again, with a divided U.S. Congress, this is not likely something that will ultimately pass through Congress, but it's just interesting to highlight that this is also an issue that's gaining attention at the federal level. Yeah, and I think that kind of summarizes where we're at right now. Some work around the edges. We'll probably see a couple of those amendments pass this year. It wouldn't surprise me. But I'm thinking new bans are probably unlikely unless it's sort of one of those more targeted approaches that we touched on.
They always give these proposals such interesting names, don't they?
Yeah. It's half the battle, right? You got to either a good acronym or a snappy name, something.
And they got to sell them somehow.
Yeah.
Well, Joe, always a pleasure. Thanks for bringing us up to speed. We'll definitely have to have you back on the show soon.
Yeah, thanks so much, Frank.
And for our listeners, you can learn more about our election coverage at the link in our show notes. We'll be back with more on the ballot soon. Make sure you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Frank Festa, and thanks for listening.